It is time for a clinically depressed Puscast covering the last 2 weeks of April 2016. Blazers just lost their first game against Golden State in the second round of the playoffs. On the brighter side, at least for me, the weather's nice, so I can do this podcast on the front porch. That means you may be hearing cars go by, birds chirping, and the ubiquitous blower. Such is life, but I'm not sitting inside on a gorgeous day to do this when I can enjoy the outside. As always, this is brought to you by Pusware LLC. You can go to edgydoc.com to find links to my growing multimedia empire, as well as the references for this podcast. But otherwise, we will move on to the literature. We've known about the importance of hand hygiene since, 1880s or so with Semmelweis? So this study looked at hand hygiene compliance and compared doctors to nurses, and you're not going to be surprised by the results. 1, nurses had 3 times more hand hygiene opportunities than physicians, but nurses were more compliant, washing their hands appropriately 76% of the time versus 52% of the time for physicians. As they stay in the conclusion, quote, hand hygiene compliance in physicians cannot be explained by burden of hand hygiene opportunities. I think it's explained by the fact that so many doctors are arrogant buttheads who don't think that the rules and the literature apply to them. That's my take after 25 years of trying to get people to wash their hands. I think it's simple. Every time someone misses a hand hygiene opportunity, you remove a finger then and there. After 10 missed opportunities, hey, no hands, no worry about compliance. In the year 2016, I must say I have zero sympathy for those who don't hand hygiene appropriately. Early in my practice, 25 years ago or so, one of my infection control nurses noted that most of our post-operative infections occurred in afternoon cases. That was never subsequently repeated, but it's always been noted that your immune system functions better at the morning than it does in the afternoon. And that was back in the day when we were less than optimal in all our skip procedures. Now there was a study that looked at the timing of your influenza vaccine. And if you got your vaccine in the morning, you had much higher levels of antibodies than if you had it in the afternoon. It did not look at efficacy, i.e. if there's any difference in influenza in the two groups. But I think if you're elderly, you need to get off your statins, as we talked about last time, and get your influenza vaccine in the morning. What is associated with a poorer outcome in elderly people with influenza, vaccination, and early oseltamivir decreased ICU admissions in a French study of elderly patients, i.e. greater than 65, who developed influenza. And that is a pretty consistent finding, that if you get early treatment with oseltamivir, or if you get the vaccine and you're a risk group, you're likelier to have a milder case of influenza. Back when I was a young whippersnapper, instead of a grumpy old fart, I thought pneumonia was a monomicrobial process. The patients had a single pathogen most of the time. That's increasingly not found to be true, and there's been several studies out to show that there are often multiple organisms in people with pneumonia. The study looked at the incidence of bacterial and viral co-pathogens in patients with severe influenza and found that it was common for them to have both a bacterial infection, 22%, or a viral infection, 4.5%. And the most common bacterial co-pathogen was Staph aureus. I would have put my money on Streptococcus pneumoniae. And unfortunately, having a bacterial co-infection delayed the start of oseltamivir, which, as we've seen in multiple studies in the ICU, means you're more likely to die. So beware the co-pathogen in patients with influenza or bacterial processes for that matter. And don't be dissing on the flu vaccine or oseltamivir. I don't know, maybe I should do these podcasts from inside, given that we're heading into mosquito season. And who knows, this could be our year in the United States for both Zika virus and chikungunya. A report out of Guadalupe showed that occasionally patients with early chikungunya will present with a sepsis-like syndrome with about a 50% mortality rate, which ain't too good. I bet some poor schmo has an immune system that responds to chikungunya with a cytokine storm to kill them. It pays to be born with the right genetic code. For those of you in the United States, there's a nice review on Zika in the New England Journal of Medicine this week. The two important features: one, it presents with a fever, rash, and arthralgias, just like chikungunya. But more importantly is the geographic distribution of the mosquitoes that carry, amongst other things, yellow fever, dengue, chikungunya, and Zika virus. And pretty much the southern half of the United States is at risk. Oregon is safe. At least for now, because those lines are going to move northward probably with climate change. So who knows, maybe this will be our first big year for chikungunya, my bet. Zika, less likely. Dengue and yellow fever, you never know. So many viruses that can cause human disease. There's the Inku virus and the Chitanga virus, both found in Finland. Both are orthobunya viruses that cause encephalitis in the summer. Mosquito-borne, they are often subclinical, but they can cause severe disease in children. There's a review of these two viruses in Emerging Infectious Diseases this month. There are just so many encephalopathy-inducing viruses out there. Regular listeners know I have a fondness for climate change-related infectious diseases. So in the Solomon Islands, they had a, quote, extreme weather event, i.e. a lot of flooding. The flooding led to an outbreak of rotavirus that then spread beyond the areas of flooding. It was a remarkable number of cases, over 6,000 cases of rotavirus and 27 deaths. Hopefully a vaccinated population will not be susceptible to this particular outbreak, but it's still quite remarkable how these outbreaks occurring with extreme weather, which sounds like some sort of MTV competition involving skateboards. When I was an intern, we always thought that RSV was a kid's disease and you did not have to worry about it in adults. One of the things that's clear with these new multiplex diagnostic tools is we're finding pathogens in adults that we didn't know were there before, such as a respiratory syncytial virus. And this study looked at the effect of RSV in adults, and it was associated with significant morbidity and mortality, especially in patients with transplants, both solid and hematologic, as well as COPD. Fortunately, though, there was an article in CID, 10, 15 years ago, that suggested that the RSV season is shrinking as the world warms. It is a winter disease, and if we get without winter, we'll see the extinction of RSV. An increase in leishmania, chikungunya, dengue, a decrease in RSV. You win a few, you lose a few. I've always found this a great way to control antibiotic resistance. As you probably know, the pneumococcal vaccine used to be 7-valent, and then it went to the 13-valent. And many of the strains that were non-susceptible to penicillin were included in the now 13-valent vaccine. And what's happened by using this vaccine is that disease due to penicillin non-susceptible organisms has declined across the board in both kids and adults. So by targeting the carriers, kids, we've seen a decrease in the number of strains that are resistant. There has been a slight increase in infections due to strains not covered by the vaccine that are also penicillin non-susceptible. It hasn't yet been a problem, but it will be. No ecological niche goes unfilled. Now that we have 13 strains covered by the vaccine, the remaining, 69 strains or so are going to become increasingly resistant to penicillin and move in and start causing disease. So what we really need is an 82-valent vaccine, which will probably be about the size of a 10cc syringe and really be painful. It's just too bad that organisms like Staph aureus and gonococcus have not appeared to be amenable to vaccines as a way to both decrease antibiotic resistance and to increase the number of people with tracking nanobots. Oh, wait. I probably shouldn't have said that. No, sorry. No tracking nanobots. That was a mistake. Most ehrlichiosis is due to Ehrlichia chaffeensis, but there's also Ehrlichia ewingii, E-W-I-N-G-I-I, which is found in dogs and white-tailed deer, mostly in the central and southeastern United States. And there's been about 40 cases of Ehrlichia ewingii in human beings. This study looked at the distribution of this pathogen in human beings and found seropositivity, well, actually, patients who had a positive PCR in Arkansas, I know, Arkansas, Indiana, Missouri, New Jersey, and New York, giving it a fairly broad distribution, although it is not a huge cause of human disease. A total of 10 people in this disease, a mere drop in the bucket compared to Ehrlichia chaffeensis or A. phagocytophilium, if I pronounce those correctly. But fortunately, nobody in Oregon had it, so I don't need to worry. It is, by the way, another tick-borne illness. And life is all about these new bugs. Don't forget, for example, Rickettsia parkeri, which is spread by amblyomma ticks, specifically the TRISTE tick. And this has now been described not only in the American South, but now, yay, Arizona. So Rickettsia parkeri is one of the Rickettsia, but this one causes an eschar. It's in the tache noire, oh, don't you love my French, version of the Rickettsia, like the Rickettsia is found in Africa. And then I talked a little while back about the new Borrelia species found at the Mayo Clinic, and that they modestly decided to call Borrelia mayonii, please. Of course, I'm desperate to have something named after me, so why should I sneer? But this is a description of the 6 cases in the Lancet of patients infected with Borrelia mayonii. Seriously, it sounds like something out of the play The Book of Mormon. Anyway, what's interesting about this organism is that patients have a high degree of spirochetes in their blood with this particular form of Borrelia, although it accounted for just a fraction of the positive studies in the Mayo Clinic. The few patients had a fever, rashes, and early neurologic findings, perhaps. So 2 patients were admitted to the hospital. So this appears to be an organism not only with a higher degree of spirocheteemia, if that's a word, but also a bit more aggressive in its initial presentation. I trained in Minneapolis, and patients often went down to the Mayo Clinic for a second opinion, and we used to get them back with the exact same diagnosis that we gave them, only a lot poorer for the tests that were ordered. So I always tended to say, hold the Mayo. I'm kind of sort of old school in a lot of ways. I think when someone comes in with septic shock or sepsis that they should get a beta-lactam plus an aminoglycoside. And nobody ever wants to do that because they fret about aminoglycoside toxicity. And they give quinolones instead, although there's buckets and buckets of quinolone resistance. This study looked at the risk of acute kidney injury after a single dose of gentamicin, and I'm shocked they didn't find any. And that makes pharmacokinetic sense. You don't get enough aminoglycoside into your kidneys after a single dose that you could conceivably cause renal toxicities unless you were a believer in homeopathy. It takes 3 or 4 doses before you start to get appreciable accumulation of aminoglycosides in kidneys. And also, if they're in acute renal failure, they're not perfusing their kidneys anyway. So I always figure a single dose of Gent is a good idea in patients who are septic. And this report does suggest that it is indeed safe to do. And after 24 hours, you got the cultures back and you know whether or not you need to continue the aminoglycoside. So instead of giving the Gent, which probably isn't nephrotoxic in a single dose, they'll give Vanc and Piptazo, which probably is nephrotoxic. The irony abounds. I don't know. Is that ironic? I listened to a lot of Alanis Morissette back in the day. I'm not certain I know what irony is. The abstract of this article reads, beta-lactam antibiotics such as penicillin, flucloxacillin, cephalexin are widely considered first-line treatment for cellulitis and erysipelas, while macrolides such as erythromycin, azithromycin, and clindamycin are widely considered second-line agents. Really? Where the hell do you practice? I can't get everybody to not treat MRSA for cellulitis/erysipelas. Bactrim, vancomycin, and dalbavancin probably get used more than cephalexin for cellulitis. It amazes me how far off the rails we have gone in the treatment of soft tissue infections, i.e. cellulitis and erysipelas, diffuse erythroderma, which is always group A strep, maybe group G strep, maybe MSSA, maybe methicillin susceptible Staphylococcus, but it ain't never MRSA. But people treat it. Anyway, this study looked at whether or not, in a meta-analysis, whether or not a beta-lactam was better than a macrolide in the treatment of cellulitis, and they found they had similar efficacy and incidence of adverse effects. Although we do have enough clindamycin resistance and erythromycin resistance in strep to give me pause to use it as first-line therapy, and I would still prefer going with a beta-lactam for any cellulitis. And for UTIs at least, the resistance to common antibiotics is jaw-dropping. This looked at all the antibiotic resistance in the United States and compared 2003 to 2012. I remember back to 1990 when I started in practice, and there was no resistance to any antibiotics. Now, ciprofloxacin resistance has gone from 3.5% to 11.8%. And TMP sulfa resistance has gone from 17 to 22% in E. coli. So basically, those two common agents should not be used empirically for UTIs because the odds of resistance is so high. However, nitrofurantoin retains susceptibility rates of 97% plus. So that's still good as long as your patient has a decent GFR. That really is, though, a mind-boggling increase in resistance in a mere 8 years. A couple of sexually transmitted disease pearls. There was a study a couple years ago now that demonstrated that newly widowed men who showed up in clinic asking for Viagra were much more likely to have an STD in the near future. Who else in the elderly group are at risk for STDs? Well, all elderly people. And people do remain sexually active into their 80s and 90s. The one important thing from this particular study out of the International Journal of STD and AIDS was that older people are far less likely to use condoms than younger people. In fact, older people are likely to never have used condoms. So that puts them at risk given their behaviors. The other interesting thing is a review of screening in men who have sex with men, and found that, quote, more than 70% of chlamydia infections and 80% of gonorrhea infections would have been missed with urine testing alone in the course of a year, emphasizing the importance of extragenital testing in men who have sex with men when looking for STDs. I turned 59 last week, and it's so depressing now. All these articles put me in the older group. But I do often wonder who that old man is who looks at me in the mirror every morning. Jesus. When I think Naegleria, I think warm lakes and the occasional case associated with neti pots and bad tap water. But I don't think of it as swimming pools. There was a case in California of a 21-year-old who died of amoebic encephalitis, and it was Naegleria. So they went looking, and they found that it was piped from a spring about a mile or two away, and this spring was quite warm as well. It was probably the source of the Naegleria. They also did not keep their pool properly chlorinated. I ask everybody, is there a routine about water exposure? Swimming pools, hot tubs, saunas, lakes, ponds, streams, oceans. But I never considered, if they had a pool, asking them how does the water get into the pool. Maybe not as big an issue here in the Great Pacific Northwest as it is in more drought-ridden places like California. Another study, this one out of Korea, demonstrating that quinolones mess with the diagnosis of tuberculosis. that it took about a week longer for the cultures to turn positive in patients who had been on more than 7 days of quinolone, although that was not statistically significant. And they were longer before they tumbled onto the diagnosis, about twice as long. Quinolones mess up the ability to diagnose TB because they do have some efficacy against the organism, so patients appear to be getting better from their routine bacterial pneumonia. Fortunately, in this study, these brief exposures, about a week of quinolones or more, did not breed tuberculosis resistance in this population, and their outcomes were the same. So you delay the diagnosis, maybe expose more people, make the cultures slower to turn positive. I've become pretty much convinced that although they can be great drugs, really, quinolones are evil. They cause retinal detachment, aortic aneurysm ruptures, Achilles tendon ruptures, they drive MRSA, they drive C. diff, they delay the diagnosis of tuberculosis, and they prolong the QT, increasing the risk of torsades in some people. It's too bad they're so good at killing organisms because they really do have a nasty side effect profile as antibiotics go. I've always been a beta-lactam person. I will probably always be a beta-lactam person. There have been a bunch of case reports of atypical mycobacterium infecting tattoos. Tattoos, of course, being one of many things that sets me apart as a grumpy old man because I don't get getting a tattoo. But you can sometimes have contaminated water or material and inject atypical mycobacteria into the tattoo and get a subsequent infection and a ruined tattoo. One case I thought I had of a mycobacterial infection of a tattoo turned out to be an allergic reaction to the red dye, which is evidently not that uncommon. But one fun case, which I'll never see a case of, is a case of leprosy in a tattoo. So the guy got the tattoo and they injected leprosy in the site and they proved it by DNA testing. I just love those kinds of exposure histories. I guess that's it. Don't have much else to say. There's some other articles, but really they're not that interesting. A new version of cyclospora that's causing an outbreak of diarrhea up in the north of Quebec that hadn't been described before. And the fact that people that get blastomycosis, pneumonia, don't get diagnosed right away, so they get too many antibiotics. But really, who considers blastomycosis up front when someone presents with pneumonia? I'm not even certain I would, and I'm quite the zebra hunter. So we will bring this particular podcast to a close. It covered the last 15 days of April 2016. The references are available at edgydoc.com, where you will find links to my growing multimedia empire. The music is by my son, back from when he was but a wee lad of 12 or so. And as always, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I shall continue to follow along with you. Thank you. In dictation, and goodbye.